Welcome to the Lessons from the Great Coaches podcast.
I've learned that you don't do it alone.
You learn so many different things from so many different coaches.
That's an elite learning environment.
Failure is not a problem. How you deal with it is a problem.
How to be resilient.
How important it is to infuse joy in the process of learning.
To be a good coach, you've got to give more than you take.
What an interesting life it is to be a leader.
Hello and welcome to the Great Coaches podcast, where we believe that there is no algorithm for leadership, and so we interview great sports coaches from around the world to try and find ideas to help all of us lead our families, our colleagues, and our teams better. As the podcast has grown, the great coaches we have interviewed have shared so much insight and wisdom that we decided to create episodes dedicated entirely to the ideas that have resonated with us the most. Today's episode is on the topic of strength and conditioning coaching, and we are joined for the discussion by Dean Benton. Dean has worked with an amazing number of elite sporting groups, such as Rugby Australia, Japan Rugby and England Rugby, as well as the rugby league teams of Brisbane, Melbourne, Newcastle and Canberra, and the Australian rules football teams Essendon and Adelaide, as well as the Australian netball team. He has also written and published extensively on topics related to strength and physical condition. He is a true authority on this important element of elite level sporting teams. And just before we go to the interview with Dean, if you like what we do here at the Great Coaches Podcast, then head over to our website, thegreatcoachespodcast.com, where you will find loads of exclusive audio and video content that you can search through, download and share. It's designed to get a conversation going and bring a different context to the challenges that your teams, organisations or family might be facing. And you can also sign up for our newsletter, which we publish weekly, that brings together all the best insights and ideas we get from the coaches that we interview on the podcast. And now, please enjoy our discussion on strength and conditioning with Dean Benton.
You're listening to the Lessons from the Great Coaches podcast.
Dean Benton, good afternoon and welcome to the Great Coaches podcast.
Good afternoon, Paul. How are you?
Oh, I'm going pretty well. A bit of a rainy day here in Sydney. What's it like down there where you are?
Sunny day, actually, ironically, in Melbourne, so no complaints whatsoever.
Well, why don't we actually start there, Dean? Why don't you tell us where you are in the world and what you've been doing so far today?
Yeah, certainly. In Melbourne, by choice. The family's elected to stay in Melbourne now. The kids are all settled in school, so I've obviously I've travelled around the world a fair bit. Probably got to the point where I was doing too much. So certainly elected to stay in Melbourne. Got my own business running these days, and also doing a little bit of consultancy with Argentinian rugby.
Argentinian rugby. Well, we can add that to the list of the world's great rugby nations you've worked for, because if I've got it right, there's England, Australia, and Japan.
That's correct, yes.
Well, actually, you've worked all over the world, Dean, and I'm sure you've met some great coaches along the way. In fact, you've worked with a couple of really big names. There's Vern Gambetta, Eddie Jones, and of course, Wayne Bennett, the great rugby league coach. But there's many, many others that you've crossed paths with. And I'm just wondering, Dean, from your perspective up close, what do you think the great ones do differently that sets them apart?
Good question. They're all different. They're all unique, and they all bring different things. But they do share some commonalities. The great coaches, they know how to win. They have a laser-like focus. They don't get distracted, nor allow staff to get distracted either. Great knowledge and experience is a given. That's just expected. But for me, it's the ability to communicate. And the good ones really, they have an innate sense and ability to teach and to sell. I think that's one thing that sets them apart. It's funny. You can always tell a respected coach when they walk into the room. The room goes quiet, and that's when you know you're amongst greatness. I think another thing that sets them apart too is charisma. The great coaches, they all have charisma, something that's very hard to define, impossible to measure. Most coaches are good motivators, but it's the charisma that separates the great coaches from the good coaches.
I don't think we've had that answer before, Dean. It's a fascinating one. How does charisma, how is it experienced in an elite coaching environment like the ones you've been involved with?
I think, as I said, it comes down to selling. They give a great sense of why. All the good coaches do that. They give a great sense of direction as to why they're there. So they, as I said, motivation is usually quite short-lived, but inspiration is much longer lasting. And as I said, selling is about the emotion. And the good coaches are very good at doing that. They're very charismatic at doing that as well. The great coaches are always good teachers, which is the mental side of things, of course. But I think that's probably the best way to explain it.
I want to talk to you a little bit about teaching versus coaching later on, but perhaps let's just start with strength and conditioning, because on an elite coaching setup, in a staff associated with one of these high-performing groups, national team or even a team in a national competition, what's the role of a good S&C coach?
I think they probably function, think, and are treated like senior assistant coaches rather than just a silo. Sometimes it's not a criticism, I suppose. It's more an observation. In Olympic sports, you'll see certain silos, but in the best professional sport programs, they're definitely seen as and treated like assistant coaches. And they're very good at contextualising how athletic performance is applied. They don't think in orthodox terms. So I'd say sometimes a strength and conditioning coach will think in terms of, well, I've got them fast, I've got them strong, et cetera, I've got them fit, I've done my job. But no, their job's not done until it's contextualised, until it's applied to the game model. Another way to think about it, whether it's AFL, rugby league, or rugby itself, best way to think about fitness, the definition for fitness is a team's ability to carry out the game model for an entire 80 minutes, or at AFL, it could be 100 minutes, of course, and beyond. But that's probably the best way to think about it. In addition to, the good ones are very good at helping out the head coach in terms of synthesising and coordinating the sports science, sports medicine. Sometimes information that is put to head coaches is quite overwhelming. These guys are, of course, very, very busy. So they can actually synthesise and play a role there for the head coaches. In many ways, as coaches, it's about the ability to take the complex and make it, well, complicated and make it simple for the head coach in their role.
Dean, does that role change on game day versus the training track?
Well, absolutely. By game day, your work's done. And sometimes I find I used to get bored on game day because there wasn't a lot to be done. So, yeah, I suppose my work was certainly in terms of preparation. That's not to say the game day is not important. A strength and conditioning coach does have a significant role to play, but it's different. Most of your work that you've done is certainly helping the players prepare, less so perform. But that's not to be just, you can't diminish your role there on game day. But certainly, yes, in the preparation of the players or athletes for that matter. Not just talking about the football and the rugby coach, of course.
Your first job in professional sport was with the Australian rugby team, and you had very little actual knowledge of the sport at that time. But I'm wondering what that experience in that role taught you that has stayed with you as you've gone on to experience other sports, other codes, other countries.
In many ways, I think it was an advantage not coming from a rugby background. I wasn't stifled by tradition and those sorts of things. So I looked at the sport from first principles. So it was a massive advantage in many ways. There's an old saying, the principles are few, methods are many. There's more similarities between sports than differences. Obviously between league and rugby and AFL. Like AFL actually has its roots in rugby. A lot of people don't know that. As you move between the sports, as I said, there's more commonalities. All the sports require training principles, training variables, athletic qualities. It's just moulding those qualities in the context of the sport in terms of what's applicable to that sport and to how much, I should say. But so coming back to your first point, I've learnt more from coaching and performance from outside of rugby and rugby league than I've learnt from within it, and I've actively gone outside the rugby codes, in particular rugby, to learn about those, and that's given me a huge advantage. I've certainly learned a lot from swimming, athletics. My background's from athletics, so soccer, and even recently ice hockey. So I think it's an advantage sometimes to come from outside the sport.
Actually, to that point, I have this fascinating quote from you. You say, "I'm not really interested in how much they lift in the gym exclusively. It's about how well it transfers to the field." It's really that idea of transference that caught my eye. And I'm wondering, what do the best coaches do to ensure the transfer to the field is really maximised?
Certainly have to work closely with the sport coaches. So if you take rugby or rugby league, you're working closely with those guys and assessing transfer rather than looking at how much they lift in the gym. It's how much strength and power they could use on the field. And those things are discernible these days by eye. Look, it's very easy, I should say, to discern in a gym environment how strong someone is, but can they apply it on the field? You can't always assume that. So you're certainly working closely with coaches on that, and looking to where the manifestations of athletic qualities are appearing actually within that player's game. And if they're not, you've got to ask, what's the missing link? And that could be numerous things. So, but as I said, but not looking at the sport in orthodox terms in terms of just numbers. It's looking at how it manifests or appears on the field.
Dean, is there an example you could share where you've worked on that missing link that you just referenced and have been able to unlock it?
Yeah, certainly. You could have, say, for instance, if you take the scrum, sometimes you'll have someone who's very strong, but it's not transferring. And examples of that could be a lack of flexibility. They can't get in and adopt certain positions, and that can come with all aspects of contact. You can see guys with significant leg power, but it's not transferring, and that could be flexibility, it could be technique. But if you just looked at the numbers, then you wouldn't know as to why that's not transferring. So I think it's important to to be assessed in terms of the application to the sport, not just by numbers and testing reports.
I guess that whole idea of looking beyond the data is a key part of your role, in fact, any coach's role. But when I was preparing for today, I was looking at some documents that you shared with me, actually, and you break down the pillars of how you define a world-class strength and conditioning coach. And I was wondering if you could just take us through those.
In many ways, coaching is like any profession. The three pillars I place weight on, of course, is knowledge. What does a person know? What does a coach know? Experience. What have they done? And their capabilities. What skills and characteristics do they have? They're the three main pillars. I think that's a good place to start. A background within the sport as an athlete is helpful. Certainly not a prerequisite to being a good coach, but it certainly offers credibility, and also a big one is empathy. That if you actually haven't done it or done it in an elite sport before, it's very hard to have empathy for what athletes are going through. So I think that's certainly important. The other one I was alluding to before, the ability to teach, train, and assess all athletic qualities. I think that's important, rather than just be the jock of the gym. To be able to work across all qualities: speed, power, strength, endurance, etc., etc. And of course, as I was alluding to before, the ability to teach it, well, aside from just coaching it, of course, or training it, and the ability to communicate it to give the athletes the reason why is critical.
Well, to that point, Dean, could you take us through the way that you differentiate teaching from coaching?
Yes, certainly. Teaching is about the acquisition of new knowledge and new skills. Coaching, on the other hand, is more focused on refining, developing knowledge and skills over time. Teaching tends to be a one-way process where the teacher transfers their knowledge to the athlete, whereas coaching is a two-way process. And as that two-way process grows over time, it actually flips around the other way. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But the coach, provides in the coaching process. As I said, it's feedback. Good coaches. I got this one from Bill Sweet. Good coaches see what athletes don't. Good athletes feel what coaches don't. So as I said, certainly coaching is a two-way process, and over time, your role then changes, whereas the athlete's having a much more significant role in terms of what they're doing. If that makes sense over time, as opposed to when they're starting off to the young athlete, so to speak.
What about this experience when you see teams having a flurry of soft tissue injuries, and it's often the S&C coach who is pointed out as being the one, if not to blame, or the one who's got a significant hand in that scenario. When that occurs, when there's a high pressure moment and the focus comes onto one element of a coaching staff, what do you see the best groups of coaches do?
Well, they don't panic. Wayne Bennett was very good at that. His ability to absorb pressure was incredible. And I think to remain rational, not be overly emotive about spates of injuries. Sometimes injuries can come down to errors. Sometimes it's just bad luck. But I suppose looking at each injury case by case, so to speak, and not becoming, as I said, too emotive about it. Particularly in professional sport, those pressures can certainly be magnified by the media a lot. And of course, it's the whole game's dependent on results, and if those injuries are linked to poor results, well, that can result in significant pressure on staff within programs, which is not pleasant.
Emotional. You mentioned emotional control there twice. Easy to say, I guess, but difficult to do in the world of high-pressure sport. Have you seen routines that people may have that are better than others when it comes to controlling their emotions?
Yeah, so I suppose it's always a state of, as I say, trait and state. Some people are less inclined to be emotive than others. Some people get better over time at controlling their emotions. Some of it comes from experience. But as I said, professional sport, can be a hard proving ground for that at times.
Dean, how has your approach to experimenting to learn changed as your career has progressed? I say this because you've authored many scientific papers, and I'm wondering how you've evolved as you've become, how this thinking of yours has evolved as you moved up, become involved with ever more sophisticated and highly performing or elite level teams.
Yeah, I see myself as a sports science educated coach rather than a sports scientist. So most of my articles are written, I suppose, are around coaching applications. Unlike science, coaching and art have no rules. So experimentation is where a lot of new things are born. And I think that's where breakthroughs happen in sport. And I think another way to really experiment within staff is, none of us are smart as all of us. And I think sometimes getting staff together and debriefing, which in itself is experimentation, and you learn as you go. I think studying facts and then reflection either by yourself or amongst staff and allows you then through experimentation to see the results of those two things.
Dean, what debriefing routines do you use?
I've been given some good ones over the years. Frank Dick has been very generous with these pro formers, but there's simple ones. What was done well, what could be done better, what could be done next time. It's usually about 5 or 6 critical questions that you would ask yourself upon reflection, or as a staff, or even on where appropriate, asking athletes, of course. And I think lots of learning comes from that organically, and through that, of course, you learn, and which is in a funny sort of way, experimentation.
Dean, I've got another interesting quote from you. You say, coaching an athlete and teaching them in the language that you use, it's not easy, and they're all different. And so you have to know how to communicate. And I guess this quote is amplified by the international experience you've had. But from traveling to all these places, what have you learnt about communication, particularly in high-pressure situations?
Yeah, as you point out, they're all different. So, and you have to be discerning, particularly in different countries and different cultures. I've had to get better at that and get better at that fast. But I think the good coaches, they have a good understanding of people, how they feel, what makes them tick, and the best way to influence them. It's not what you say; it's what they hear, perceive, and more particularly feel. I think that's very important. So it's certainly in high pressure situations, accuracy, sincerity, and brevity of communication is very, very important.
You talked then about hearing, precision, feeling. You talked about what makes the athlete tick, and precision and brevity. And I'm interested if you could share an example with us of how you've read these things and looked beyond the data to help an individual or a team perform.
Yes. Just trying to think offhand of a certain situation. But I think when I first started out coaching, I was, like a lot of young coaches, quite transactional. As I've got towards my latter years, I would say I'm latter, but I'm only 54, you're much more transformational. And you sit down, you have a discussion with an athlete about where they want to go, where they think they need to go, rather than you telling them where you think that they need to go. So rather than planning for them, you plan with them, and you get much, much better results by taking that approach. So that's probably, I think by doing that, you get a sense of what makes them tick, and the best way to influence them. And then in many ways, they're actually helping you design their programs. And once you do that, you have buy-in. And we don't none of us like to have decisions made for us, I should say. So consulting them is something that I've got better in over the years, I think.
Well, I want to pick up on this theme actually, because you started coaching track and field in the sprints area way back in 1996. And I'm curious, Dean, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your younger self?
Certainly be more patient. So if I was talking to myself, being more patient. Patience is also how you act, of course, when you have to wait longer than what you think you should. I think that's very important. And also, too, knowing your blind spots as well. Knowing what you know what you don't know but need to know. Find out from others what you don't know that you don't know. Because we all, as I said, we all have blind spots, Kruger-Dunning effect, as they say. And find out who does know and invest in them. That would be probably some of the main things. But the other things I would have to suggest is I would have told myself many years ago to listen a lot more, talk a lot less, ask more informed questions, I suppose considered questions than uninformed statements. Coaching gives you many opportunities to say nothing. I think you should take advantage of all of them. Other ones, of course, is being present. I think sometimes, particularly at home, I think that's very important. And being present and not being in the past or the future, and actually listening a lot better. Other ones, coaching can't be taught; it can only be learnt. And you certainly can't learn to coach on the internet. It's a craft that must be practiced and experienced over time. So there's certainly no shortcuts to experience, and you can't buy experience, as we always say.
I know that you're very passionate about learning through experience, and you also have a very strong vision for where you would like the role of the strength and conditioning coach to go in Australia. And I guess so my final question is, in the distant future, if you do ever hang up the whistle, what's the legacy that you hope you have left when it comes to the role, perhaps I'll even go deeper, the art and the science of strength and conditioning coaching?
Well, I'm not sure how influential I am here, but I think it's gone away from the art. It's probably gone a little bit to being a little bit too data driven. So I suppose a swing back to being more balanced between the art and the science. As I said, I'm not quite sure how much influence I have in that, but yeah, you talked to a lot of the older guys, and that's their observations, and I agree with them. But yeah, I think these days we're completely over-endowed with information and devoid on how to use it these days. And I think it's easy to get seduced into data and to technology, but as I said, it's the wisdom of how to apply it in a coaching environment, which I think is not always present these days.
Dean, I think that's not only true of S&C coaching, I think it's true of all facets of life, whether it's parenting or in the boardroom too. So thank you very much for your time today. I've enjoyed learning a little bit more about strength and conditioning coaching. It comes up so often in these interviews, and prior to meeting you, I didn't know as much about it as I liked. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope, I wouldn't say good luck to the Argentinian team, but good luck for you in your role with them anyway.
Thanks, Paul.
Hi everyone, you have been listening to our episode on strength and conditioning with Dean Benton. And I hope you found a few ideas that you can bring to your own dinner table, locker room or boardroom table for discussion. And just before we go, if you have any feedback, then please let us know. The interaction with the people around the world who listen gives us great energy. And all the details on how you can get in contact with us are in the show notes or on our website, thegreatcoachespodcast.com.